For decades, the nation's agricultural heartland was praised as a model of collective productivity until the sky turned cruel. In the summer of 1932, the clouds failed to come, and with each passing month, the fields that once fed millions fell barren. The drought that stretched from 1931 through 1933 was not merely a weather anomaly, it became the catalyst for a tragedy that would claim 4 to 6 million lives. What unfolded next was not an isolated mistake, but a coordinated system, one that allowed scarcity to be weaponized in the name of political ambition. The first rains failed, and the grain-filled silos that had been built up during more prosperous years began to empty. Farmers watched their harvests wither under relentless heat, while state forecasters reported record-low precipitation across the central provinces. The drought's reach was total, from the rolling steppes of the south to the fertile valleys of the north. Every plot of cultivated land showed signs of failure. Villagers whispered about the looming famine, but official bulletins dismissed the reports as temporary setbacks, urging patience and continued labor on the collective farms. Behind closed doors, the Central Agricultural Committee convened an emergency session. Their agenda was not to allocate the dwindling reserves to starving villages. Instead, they decided to divert a substantial portion of the grain stockpiles to finance an upcoming political campaign that would cement the party's dominance in the next election cycle. Minister of Food Supplies Victor Lerin signed off on the export directive, arguing that foreign currency was essential for national security and that the regime could not afford to appear weak on the international stage. The decision ignored mounting evidence from agronomists warning that any reduction in domestic distribution would push already vulnerable populations past the breaking point. The committee's rationale rested on a cold calculation. The political rally would secure loyalty, while the famine could be blamed on natural forces beyond anyone's control. In their memoranda, officials wrote of strategic sacrifice and framed the reallocation as an unavoidable cost of maintaining state stability. Even as grain stores dwindled, ships laden with wheat left the ports for foreign markets. The export quotas were raised dramatically, and the government praised the influx of hard currency that would fund industrialization projects and military modernization. In urban centers, food prices began to climb sharply. Bread lines stretched longer each day, and merchants whispered about the paradox of seeing grain being loaded onto ships while their customers struggled to afford a simple loaf. Rural collectives reported empty granaries, yet the state's trade statistics boasted record shipments abroad. The policy was clear. The regime prioritized external prestige over internal survival. The revenue generated was funneled directly into the party apparatus, financing propaganda campaigns and consolidating power in regions far removed from the starving fields. Humanitarian organizations from neighboring countries extended offers of aid, proposing grain shipments and medical assistance to alleviate the crisis. Those overtures were met with a blanket refusal from the central government. Internal pleas from regional officials, letters pleading for emergency relief, were intercepted, censored, and in many cases destroyed. The Regional Peasant Union, an emerging grassroots network, began documenting the suffering in secret journals, sending coded reports to foreign consulates. Their attempts to publicize the famine were systematically suppressed. Newspapers were instructed to focus on national achievements rather than temporary agricultural setbacks. State security forces monitored any dissenting voices, and those who dared to speak out faced intimidation or arrest. The suppression of information ensured that the true scale of the disaster remained hidden from both domestic audiences and the international community. As the famine deepened, General Alexei Morozov received orders to mobilize troops for a new purpose: the forced relocation of starving peasants to distant labor camps under the pretext of re-education and national service. Entire villages were rounded up at night, their inhabitants marched across barren steppe to remote construction sites where they would be put to work on infrastructure projects that benefited the state's strategic goals. These relocations further disrupted agricultural production. Fields left untended fell into ruin, irrigation systems collapsed without regular maintenance. The labor force that could have been used to cultivate a modest harvest was instead conscripted into arduous tasks far from their homes, exacerbating food shortages, both in the countryside and in the cities where the displaced workers were eventually sold as cheap labor. The policy served a dual purpose. It removed potential sources of unrest and supplied the regime with a pool of expendable workers for its grand projects. By 1933, mortality rates surged across the affected regions. Local officials, aware that acknowledging the full scale of the disaster would invite scrutiny, began to keep covert records of excess deaths. These hidden ledgers noted unexplained spikes in burial numbers and listed causes such as fever or unknown illness, masking the underlying starvation. Families buried their loved ones in unmarked graves, and entire villages were depopulated within months. The official death toll released by the government remained vague, citing a range of 4 to 6 million, a figure that reflected both the enormity of the tragedy and the regime's reluctance to provide precise data. The silence surrounding these numbers was intentional. By keeping the statistics ambiguous, the state could claim it was dealing with an unforeseen natural calamity, deflecting responsibility for policy choices that had amplified the crisis. Decades later, after the war and a change of leadership, previously classified archives were open to scholars. Within them lay internal memos from the Central Agricultural Committee explicitly discussing the famine as a deterrent against dissent in rural areas. The documents revealed that grain exports had been deliberately increased despite clear evidence of domestic scarcity, and that the redirection of reserves to fund political campaigns was approved at the highest levels. The archives also contained correspondence between Minister Larin and General Morozov, outlining coordinated plans for forced relocations, framed as necessary measures to stabilize the countryside. These records painted a stark picture. The famine was not an accident of weather, but a calculated outcome of policies designed to reinforce state control. Historians analyzing these files concluded that the tragedy was embedded within a broader system of governance, where secrecy, repression, and economic manipulation were normalized tools for maintaining power. Scholars now assess this famine as a grim example of how scarcity can be weaponized by an authoritarian apparatus. The deliberate diversion of grain, the continuation of exports, the suppression of aid, and the forced displacement of populations all functioned to weaken potential opposition while enriching the regime's political capital. The legacy of these policies reverberates in contemporary debates about food security and state responsibility. Modern policymakers cite this episode when arguing for transparency in agricultural planning and for safeguards that prevent the politicization of essential resources. The memory of those millions who perished serves as a cautionary tale. When a government treats famine as a labor rather than a humanitarian emergency, the cost is measured not only in lives lost, but in the erosion of trust between people and their rulers. Reflecting on this dark chapter reminds us that vigilance against the instrumentalization of scarcity remains essential. The shadows of suppressed history must be illuminated, lest similar patterns ever re-emerge under new guises.